The Butterflies by Edmund Cooper. Originally published in a collection of the author's stories called Tomorrow's Gift, which was given a German translation in 1964. Each of its subsequent appearances was also in collections of the author's tales, all with varying content. The next of these was called News from Elsewhere in 1968, which had a Spanish translation in 1970, then Unborn Tomorrow in 1971, and Jupiter Laughs and Other Stories in 1979. Read by Darrell T. Smith II for my channel, Quasar Spectra. The Butterflies. The survey ship Prometheus dropped into orbit 400 miles above the surface of Planet 5. Altogether, there were 7 planets in the system. They belonged to the companion of Sirius, a white dwarf which had the distinction of being the first star to be recognized by terrestrial astronomers before it could be seen. Planet 5 was 22 million miles from the mother sun. Sirius itself lay far beyond the confines of the tiny system, being another 1,800 million miles away. To the crew of the Prometheus, it presented a bright, blinding disk, no less impressive than that of its now relatively near companion. Eventually, the Prometheus would voyage closer to the great star to survey her single red planet. But meanwhile, the companion's system seemed infinitely more attractive, an explorer's paradise. When the orbit maneuver had been successfully completed, the crew of 4 took themselves to the mess deck for a celebration. They had something to celebrate, for so far as they knew, the Prometheus was the first ship to navigate satisfactorily under what was called the relativity drive, in memory of a very great man and a very imperfect theory. As soon as they took their places at table, the electronic cooker disgorged roast chicken and a wealth of elegant trimmings, and the refrigerator surrendered a magnum of champagne. Only 3 of the crew, however, were able to savor the luxury of drinking wine 8.5 light years away from the vineyard that produced it. For the 4th, a positronic robot, preferred to dine infrequently on a large helping of amperes. Presently, Captain Trenoy, physicist, astronomer, and master of the Prometheus, gave a formal toast, while Whizbang, the robot, watched with red, expressionless eyes. "May our explorations be fruitful," said Captain Trenoy, raising his glass. "May our return be safe, and may the time drag not be too heavy on us." "Amen," said Dr. Blaine. He and Dr. Luis regarded each other gravely as they lifted their glasses in response. They were both thinking about the same thing. The journey of 8.5 light years had taken the Prometheus 18 kinetic months, but the ship had left the solar system 15 Earth years before. By the time it returned, more than 35 Earth years would have gone by, though the crew would have aged a mere 3.5 years. Blaine, who combined the duties of psychologist, surgeon, and physician, was contemplating the spiritual effect of being cut off from one's time and generation. Fortunately, or otherwise, it was a problem that would have no reality until the Prometheus touched down on Earth once more. Luis, who held the departments of biochemistry and geology, stared at his champagne and wondered just how long it would take him to go mad. But such disturbing thoughts slid rapidly into the background as Captain Trenoy, refilling the 3 glasses, turned the conversation to the immediate problem of touching down on Planet 5. After 18 months of monotonous starflight, during which there was little to do but make routine checks, routine researches, routine conversation, it was pleasant, if unnerving, to be faced with the necessity for action. "Here endeth the first lesson," said the captain with obscure irony. "And now we'd better fix up some orderly procedure. I am assuming, of course, that you feel we ought to explore as soon as possible." He gazed at his companions inquiringly. "No reason why we shouldn't," said Dr. Luis. "I've checked Whizbang's preliminary findings. It doesn't seem as if there will be much difficulty." "I haven't any objections," agreed Blaine. Then he added with a dry smile, "But in view of our experience of the unusual effects of star sickness, it might be advisable if we sent Whizbang by himself on the first trip." "I was about to suggest that myself," said Trenoy. "It would be an elementary safety procedure. I think, too, that we should fix it so that we can control the landing rocket from here, just in case Whizbang comes to grief. It would be disastrous if we lost a ferry rocket on the first landing."
"What makes you think I might come to grief, Captain?"
boomed the robot.
"The findings indicate that it's going to be a smooth job."
Trenoy laughed. "You're as logical as they come, Whizbang," he said. "But we poor mortals, lacking your mental equipment, tend to be just a little superstitious. To us, as to the primeval savages, the unknown is always a little magical, in spite of science, in spite of reason, and in spite of infallible robots." Whizbang made some strange noises, which his companions had long learned to interpret as robotic laughter.
"So I noticed," he retorted. "When we changed down to planetary drive out of RD, Dr. Blaine, our eminent psychologist, was, I recall, furiously stroking a rabbit's paw."
Blaine smiled. "No need to feel superior, Whizbang. I saw you playing with a new set of logarithmic notations. It was the first time I've ever seen a robot doodling." "All right, doodler," said Captain Trenoy. "Tell us what you've discovered about Planet 5, and we'll decide if there's likely to be any difficulty." Whizbang recited his information with monotonous efficiency.
"Size equates approximately with terrestrial moon. Mass 1/83.2. Density 3.79. Orbital period 98 days. Surface 3/5 solid. Atmosphere, oxygen helium 4550. Vegetation, low-type scrub with unusual predominance of blue. No evidence of animal life."
"Suppose we put you down," said Luis. "What would you do?"
"Take out Radiac and test at ground level," answered Whizbang promptly. "Collect samples and explore to a radius of 100 yards. Radio verbal report to Captain Trenoy and await instructions."
"Fair enough," said Trenoy. "Down you go."
"I've already checked the ferry rocket," announced Whizbang. "Radiac and sample jars are aboard."
He stood up and stretched his 9 foot of steel and duralumin.
"Shall I make ready, sir?"
he asked formally. "No time like the present," said Trenoy. "Go ahead. Come back and tell us 5 minutes before point of exit." The 3 men stood on the navigation deck of the Prometheus, watching the small ferry rocket drift out of the orbit. As it receded in slow motion, Whizbang waved a metal arm cheerily to them from inside his plexiglass dome. "Are we going to stabilize position over his landing area?" asked Dr. Blaine. "Might as well," said the captain. "There's no reason for playing safe on fuel. Thank God those days are over." The ferry rocket, gathering negative speed, dropped like a silver bullet to the vast brown and crimson stretch of lava plains below. "The atmosphere is a piece of cake," said Dr. Luis happily. It looks as if we shall be able to throw off our pressure suits and jump about freely at 1/6 gravity. It may be my natural pessimism, observed Dr. Blaine, but I have an odd notion that Planet 5 is altogether too obliging. Something tells me that we're in for a few surprises. I think you're right, agreed Trenoy. There's always surprises in this kind of work. It would be somewhat surprising if there weren't. He turned his attention to the two-way radio. Prometheus to Whizbang. Prometheus to Whizbang. How are you doing? Over. He turned a switch, and Whizbang's voice came loud and clear.
Whizbang to Captain Trenoy. I am skating cautiously through the boundaries of the stratosphere at 100,000 feet. Velocity 5,000. Fin temperature 1,500. Internal temperature 103. It's easy going. Over.
What does the surface look like? Asked Trenoy.
As expected, Captain. Blue vegetation areas change shade slightly, purple to crimson. But this may be due to invisible cloud. Over.
Are you using the autopilot? Over, asked the captain. He heard the robot laugh.
I am more efficient, sir. The autopilot would take 3 minutes longer. Over.
Watch that fin temperature, snapped Trenoy. It's more important than trying to beat the autopilot. Over and out.
Yes, sir. Over and out.
Whizbang did his best to sound metallically aggrieved. 7 minutes later, he touched the ferry rocket down to a perfect landing.
Whizbang to Prometheus. I have touched down on the agreed area on Planet 5. Landing normal. Fuel consumption subnormal. What are your orders? Over.
Back on the Prometheus, Captain Trenoy gripped the mic, glancing at the two men with controlled excitement. He flicked the switch and spoke to Whizbang. Do not move. Describe the landscape. Over.
Sunlight strength 4,
said Whizbang.
Sky purple to deep blue. Horizon bounded by mountain range. Estimated height of the highest peak, 9,000 feet. Distance 12 miles. Planetary surface rock, crimson, brown, black. Nearest vegetation, 300 yards away. Pampas-type grass, 4 to 6 feet high. Color blue to crimson. Occasional bushes with tendril-type leaves rising to 10 feet. Color yellow to gold. Animal life, butterfly-type wingspan 9 to 15 inches, multicolored, present in large numbers. Estimated cloud of 20 to 30 circling ferry rocket. Large clouds in constant motion above Pampas. Over.
On the navigation deck of the survey ship, the atmosphere of excitement intensified. Butterflies! Exclaimed Dr. Luis. This is going to be interesting. They're quite a reasonably developed evolutionary structure. Obviously, there will be other examples of animal life, even if they're only vestigial species relating to the butterfly's development. Dr. Blaine laughed. Maybe we'll have to take nets with us and dash around like 3 bug-collecting schoolboys. At 1/6 G, we ought to be able to chase them on the wing. Not so fast, said Trenoy. Let's see how they react to Whizbang, and he to them. He flicked the radio switch and spoke once more to the robot, who sat patiently in the pilot's seat of the ferry rocket 400 miles below. Prometheus to Whizbang. Take out your radiac, your atmospherometer, and the Cine camera. Make 5 tests for radioactivity, 1 general and 4 specific. Find out the pressure and bulk gases, and bring samples back for lab work. Then take your camera and use 15 minutes of film. Spread it out. Panoramic stuff. Telephoto, microphoto, and general interest. Also, get a butterfly if possible, without harming it. Over.
Yes, sir, answered Whizbang. When shall I report? Over.
Don't be lazy, said Trenoy. Clip the transceiver on your chest. We'll want a record while you're operating. Over.
As you say, Captain. Would you like a commentary or question and answer? Over.
Commentary will do. If I want to ask questions, I'll break in. Over and out. The men on the navigation deck waited for the robot's monologue to begin. Dr. Luis went to the manual telescope and began to search the landing area with it. After a moment or two, fancying a shiny dot that he'd picked out was the ferry rocket, he called Captain Trenoy to take a look. Then Whiz-Bang launched into his commentary.
Transceiver clipped on. I am now descending through oubliette with Radiac. Pressure equalized at 9.9. Ladder down and entry port released. I am going down the ladder. General radioactivity normal for oxygen helium at 9.9. Will now proceed 50 yards from rocket for 4 radial tests.
Trenoy switched across. How are the butterflies reacting to your presence?
They don't appear to have noticed me yet. Am now making first of radial tests. The butterflies have just begun to notice me. The ones circling above the rocket aren't being tempted, but another cloud of about 50 has risen from the pampas. They're heading straight for me. Now they're circling overhead.
See if you can get one, but don't alarm them if it can be helped, said Trenoy.
They're fast on the wing, Captain, and they seem to be able to estimate my range. They're concentrating about 20 feet above my headpiece.
There was a long pause. Then,
flutter by, butterfly. Flutter, flutter, butterfly. Well, well, well. Cut off my coordinators and call me a computer. I think that I shall never see a robot beautiful as me.
For the first time in his existence, Whiz-Bang sounded as if he were trying to sing. It was an unmelodious, robotic howl. To the men on the Prometheus, it sounded midway between ecstasy and insanity. With a startled oath, Captain Trenoy switched in. Whiz-Bang! What the devil's happening? There was no answer for several seconds. Then a slurred voice mumbled,
Steel, steel, glorious steel. You'll never know how metallic I feel.
Whiz-Bang! Answer my question! Trenoy put every ounce of authority into his command. The response was not encouraging.
With nuts on his fingers and bolts on his toes, Whiz-Bang needs oiling wherever he goes.
The voice trailed away to a crooning whisper. Then silence. The 3 men stared at each other in consternation. He's off his head, snapped Luis. Some damn silly short circuit has given him DTs. Dr. Blaine looked thoughtful. He was perfectly all right until those butterflies began to concentrate. I wonder, what are you thinking of? Radiation? Asked Captain Trenoy. Something like that, agreed Blaine. It doesn't sound like a mechanical breakdown. I've never heard of a robot getting lightheaded because of a short circuit. It's as if some force had disturbed his equilibrium. The STEX robots were proofed against every known type of radiation before we left Earth, objected the captain. I know, said Blaine, but obviously this is something they weren't proofed against. The simple solution is usually correct, said Luis. He's had a breakdown in the language areas. He was all right while he was in the rocket. I'll try him again, said Trenoy. He switched over. Whiz-Bang! Can you hear me? Over. Silence. Whiz-Bang! What's happening? Over. Silence. Whiz-Bang! I order you back to the rocket. Make ready to return to ship. Over. Still silence. Where do we go from here? Asked Captain Trenoy at length. Any suggestions, gentlemen? Somebody will have to go down in the reserve rocket, said Dr. Luis. That somebody had better be me. Control your curiosity and be rational, reproved Dr. Blaine. What's the point of hazarding our only other rocket and a human being? Have another think. Total control, exclaimed the captain. The servo mechanisms for the oubliette and entry port were synchronized with the autopilot before Whiz-Bang went down. Even if we can't get him back to the ferry rocket, we can bring the rocket back here. Then someone might go down and see what's happened to him. Before Captain Trenoy settled down at the remote control panel, he made a further effort to contact the enigmatic robot, but met with no success. While he was bringing the rocket back to the 400-mile orbit, Doctors Blaine and Luis developed a quiet and friendly argument concerning the probable cause of Whiz-Bang's failure to respond. Then, as Whiz-Bang still presumably had the transceiver on his chest, Dr. Blaine tried to break down his problematic silence by a series of commands, exhortations, trick statements, and desperate pleas for help. He met with no result. You see, said Luis triumphantly, it's a mechanical breakdown. If he won't even let out a bleat when you tell him it's a matter of life and death, it means only one thing. Somewhere the circuit is wrecked. Dr. Blaine still shook his head. Robots have certain powers of volition, he said slowly. Weaker, of course, than human volition. Now, let us suppose, for the purpose of hypothesis, that something with greater than human volition was able to establish contact with him. Suppose it willed him to disobey orders. Moonshine, pronounced Dr. Luis skeptically. Are you suggesting that Whiz-Bang got himself hypnotized? Because if so, you're getting unnecessarily melodramatic. One has to consider possibilities, said Dr. Blaine evenly. But that's an impossibility. You might just as well consider the possibility of the ground opening up and swallowing him. It can't be ruled out, said Blaine without humor. Who are we to assume that the life forms on Planet 5 behave conventionally? Those butterflies, for example, might lay duck eggs, grinned Luis. Go take a sedative, Doctor. Your imagination is slightly fantastic. So very often is the truth, retorted Blaine. While he had been talking, Dr. Blaine had watched the progress of the ferry rocket by radar screen and visulator. He saw now that it was within ordinary visual range and, not wishing to prolong a useless discussion, climbed into the Astrodome to watch it dock alongside the Prometheus. I still think one man only should go, and that he should not leave the rocket, unless, of course, he finds a reasonable explanation for Whiz-Bang's silence. Watching the captain closely, Dr. Blaine could see, even before he replied, that Trenoy was unconvinced. Perhaps you're letting superstition take precedence over scientific caution, said Captain Trenoy with the faintest of smiles. I think our arrangements will be quite adequate. We shall take U.S. vibrators and HFC beam apparatus. Unless there's an emergency, one of us will remain in the rocket all the time. You may encounter something against which the vibrators and HFC weapon will be useless. In that case, it certainly won't be physical, observed Dr. Luis with irony. Exactly, said Blaine. He wanted to add something else, but couldn't find the right words. We'd better get moving, remarked Trenoy. We may have a small search on our hands before we find Whiz-Bang. Dr. Blaine accepted defeat gracefully. "Good hunting," he said. "I'll be glued to the transceiver. We'll bring you back a couple of tame butterflies to play with," promised Luis gaily as he fixed the headpiece on the pressure suit. When they had checked their pressure and personal radios, the two men left the navigation deck and made their way to the starboard airlock and entry port. From the Astrodome, Dr. Blaine watched the small ferry rocket fall out of the orbit as it gathered negative speed. 20 minutes later, he heard Luis's voice telling him that they had touched down safely at the landing area. "We can see Whiz-Bang," said Luis excitedly. "He's about a couple of 100 yards away, balancing on one foot like a heavyweight ballerina. The butterflies are still circling over him." He chuckled. "Bet they're thinking that if he's a specimen of alien culture, they did well to remain butterflies. He looks, though, almost as if he belongs to the landscape." "Any other signs of life, apart from the butterflies?" asked Dr. Blaine. "No, not yet. I'm going out to have a look at our petrified robot, so I'll hand over to Captain Trenoy." Dr. Blaine's hands were trembling. His face was white. He paced the navigation deck rapidly, casting suspicious glance now and again at the 9-foot robot, who stood waiting patiently. "Tell me your story again," he commanded. "We will consider the inaccuracy in relation to the whole." It was no good calling the robot a liar, because Whiz-Bang was mechanically incapable of lying. He was, however, quite capable of being inaccurate. Responding to the order, he again related his story in a voice which faltered only very slightly when he came to the part which Dr. Blaine was able to disprove.
"The first thing I remember, sir," said Whiz-Bang, "was Dr. Luis bawling at me for being what he called a broken-down cretin. Previous to that, my only recollection is of reporting back to ship as I began the first radial test, and the butterflies came."
"Where were the butterflies when Dr. Luis spoke to you?"
"They were circling the rocket again, sir, but there were none near me or Dr. Luis. The clouds skimming over the pampas seemed bigger than before, but that was probably because Dr. Luis had disturbed them. He told me he'd given the group circling above my head half a second of ultrasonic vibration, and that it had scared them away."
"Did he tell you his further intentions?"
"He said he was going to look around within 100 yards radius and collect samples. Then he ordered me back to the rocket."
"What did Captain Trenoy do?"
"He questioned me and then spoke to you, sir, describing the landscape in detail and giving you a commentary on Dr. Luis's activities."
"Why did Captain Trenoy leave the rocket?"
Dr. Luis called to him over the personal wavelength in a very excited voice. He said that he'd found the skeleton of a large quadruped with a cranial capacity of approximately 1 cubic foot. He said that the animals on Planet 5 must have reached a very high evolutionary stage. Finally, he suggested that Captain Trenoy came and had a look for himself, leaving me in the rocket. The captain said it didn't seem a very intelligent procedure, but Dr. Luis replied that there were no living animals in sight, that the pampas was far enough away to give a reasonable safety margin, and that if the butterflies came near, they could certainly be dispersed by ultrasonics.
Dr. Blaine nodded. "That's true. I heard snatches of their conversation over the transceiver. Did Captain Trenoy give you any instructions before he left?"
"He put me through a simple test to make sure that my memory and reasoning ability were not damaged. Then he told me to stay in the rocket and not leave it under any circumstances."
At which point, said Dr. Blaine thoughtfully, you took over the commentary.
That is so,
agreed Whizbang with a trace of hesitation.
I continued with the commentary until you gave me instructions to return to the Prometheus.
But since I did not radio those instructions, said Blaine, staring hard at the robot, we are left with two possibilities. Name them. The robot was silent for a moment. Then he spoke slowly.
1. That my circuits are damaged. 2. That some other entity caused me to receive the message.
Which do you think it is? Snapped Blaine.
If you would like to test me, sir,
began Whizbang. To hell with tests. Which is it?
I think my circuits are intact.
Then you think the message originated elsewhere?
Yes, sir. If you are sure you did not send it.
Blaine controlled himself with difficulty. We'll leave that for the moment. Repeat verbatim your commentary to the point where I apparently ordered you to return.
Whizbang to Prometheus, said the robot. Captain Trenoy is now descending through the oubliette to join Dr. Luis. Dr. Luis is examining the skeleton of the quadruped. The nearest butterflies are about 200 yards away. There is a small cloud of them rising from the pampas. They appear to be circling aimlessly at an altitude of 150 feet. Captain Trenoy has now joined Dr. Luis. They are digging together by the side of the skeleton. The butterflies are drifting slightly. Captain Trenoy glances at them every few seconds while continuing his work. Now the cloud is almost above the skeleton at about 200 feet. Suddenly the two men stand up. They stare at the butterflies. Dr. Luis remarks over his personal radio that it is the most incredible thing he ever heard. Suddenly the butterflies drop 50 feet. At the same time, Captain Trenoy and Dr. Luis begin to unscrew their headpieces very slowly.
Whizbang stopped. Go on, urged Dr. Blaine.
Then, sir, said Whizbang, I heard your voice through the transceiver. You said, Prometheus to Whizbang, return to orbit immediately. Urgent, return to orbit immediately. Over and out.
What happened next? Asked Blaine.
I informed Captain Trenoy over the ground radio. He said, you must obey, Whizbang. You must always obey. So I sealed the rocket and took off as rapidly as possible. By the time I had equalized gravity and was beginning to release power, the butterflies had dropped another 50 feet. Captain Trenoy and Dr. Luis were standing motionless. They had taken off their headpieces. Then I had to let in power, and the rocket climbed.
Was Captain Trenoy's voice normal?
No, sir. He spoke slowly and very quietly.
Are you sure it was his voice?
Yes, sir.
For 2 or 3 minutes, Dr. Blaine strode nervously up and down, tortured by indecision. Finally, he made up his mind. I'm going down, Whizbang.
Yes, sir.
You will remain on duty here. Dr. Blaine set the rocket down gently. He unstrapped himself, stood up, and gazed through the plastic glass dome. A quarter of a mile away, he saw 2 motionless figures standing erect on a stretch of brown and crimson rock. Focusing the binoculars, Dr. Blaine made out a cloud of butterflies hovering about 10 feet above the men. The heads of his two companions were strangely obscured, but dull sunlight glinted on the surface of a headpiece lying at the feet of one of them. Grimly, Dr. Blaine reached for the two U.S. vibrators. Placing them carefully in the pockets of his pressure suit, he descended through the oubliette. A few seconds later, he stood on the strange surface of Planet 5. Gripping a vibrator in each hand, he looked cautiously around him, and then up at the sky. Apart from the cloud above the two men a quarter of a mile away, and the endless activity on the pampas, there did not seem to be any immediate danger. Slowly, Dr. Blaine walked towards his companions. At 100 yards he stopped, stood quite still, took careful aim. He gave the cloud of butterflies a 2-second dose of vibration. They scattered with much violent flapping, and a few dropped crazily down to the rocky surface. As they fell, another small cloud rose, and Dr. Blaine knew then what had been obscuring the heads of Trenoy and Louise. He fought back a sharp, involuntary sickness and marched on. At 50 yards, he thought it was an illusion, but at 25 yards it became inescapable fact. Dr. Blaine was approaching two men in pressure suits who were dead but still standing. Their clean-picked skulls were fixed in two barren grins. In his own pressure suits, Blaine was sweating with panic. A sixth sense warned him to turn round and run, but it was already too late. For, to Dr. Blaine's heightened perception, there came the first faint strains of a vast, compelling music. It was the pattern, the experience, the mobility, the sheer harmony of 1,000 symphonies condensed into a single chord. Turning with a tremendous effort, he saw the butterflies rising from the pampas, and knew, in the instant before the colossal theme of ecstasy blocked all thought, that presently the butterflies would begin to circle lower and lower. There were tears in Dr. Blaine's eyes, but they were not tears for his own approaching death. They were the only way in which he and his companions before him could react to an experience that was profound beyond any known to man. That was compelling and final, tearing its way past the flimsy threshold of human consciousness. The vibrators dropped from his impatient fingers. Slowly, hypnotically, Dr. Blaine fumbled for the release clips of his headpiece, and the music swelled like sacramental thunder. The soundless music of thousands of multicolored butterflies, thousands of insect carnivores closing in upon their selected prey. And across the pampas, across the brown and crimson rocks, myriads of flapping wings proclaimed their centralization of power, submergence of the individual in a tremendous group identity. Dr. Blaine stood there, unable to think, unable to see, unable to move, waiting for the butterflies to descend, waiting for the crunch of small but powerful mandibles. The short 9-hour day on Planet 5 drew quietly to a close. Then the sun, known to Earthlings as the companion of Sirius, began to slip smoothly over a blue and purple horizon. Presently, the butterflies rose, winging across the pampas to their nocturnal bat-like roosts. Presently, there was only the solitude of night, the remote mystery of stars. The survey ship Prometheus remained in orbit for 10 more days. Whizbang, the robot, kept a steady vigil by the transceiver on the navigation deck in accordance with instructions, but the lack of response to his repeated signals forced him to the obvious conclusion. He satisfied himself that there was one very sound reason why there could be no survivors. For men, unlike robots, cannot exist without water. Unfortunately, the water on Planet 5 was different from its terrestrial counterpart. belonging to a different geological cycle. Its chemical symbol was infinitely more complex than a mere H2O. So, Whizbang brought in an open verdict, secure in the conviction that his masters could no longer be alive. He had, however, no knowledge of the manner of their deaths. When he, too, had been a victim of the butterfly mind, he had not heard the compelling music, for it was reaching to something far deeper than a synthetic brain. He had merely been positronically disturbed. He had merely been, for the first time in his robotic existence, asleep while his batteries were still powered. Nor could he know that, with a superior act of volition, the butterfly mind had simply willed him to go away. Being metallic, he was not a possible source of food, and not being a source of food, he was only irrelevant. But even a robot must rationalize when forced to act without human command. So, Whizbang had found it necessary to invent Dr. Blaine's instruction to return to the Prometheus. Standing now on the navigation deck, he stared with red, expressionless eyes at the surface of Planet 5. At last, he reached a decision. The information would have to be given to other human beings who would then assume responsibility. Whizbang jerked himself up into the Astrodome and began to take bearings. As he worked, he knew neither happiness nor anxiety, neither hope nor despair, neither regret nor relief. He knew only that he could handle the relativity drive more efficiently than men